Welcome back to another episode of Buckle Up with Simon and Brian, an ultra running conversation. How are you doing today, Simon?
I'm doing great. How are you, Brian? How are your knees?
I'm doing well. I've still logging miles, still getting the training in, and my knees are doing well. The weather's starting to change here. It's kind of exciting as well. So we're finally getting rid of some of the snow in the neighborhood and making for some dry roads and some somewhat dry trails. How about yourself, Simon? How are you doing?
Doing great. It's been a few weeks since my last race, Antelope Canyon. I just posted it. It was a great movie recap. But otherwise, training is going well. Weather in San Diego is always the same, so good weather still. Putting in some miles ahead of Cocodona, which is coming up pretty fast, actually.
Hey, Simon, are you eating enough?
That is a great question, Brian. I would need someone to tell me.
So today's episode, we just got off the call with Jen from Active Fueling Nutrition Coaching. And Jen resides in Eagle, Colorado. She's got a master's in exercise science and a certification in nutrition through UCCS. And on her website, she specifically says she might suggest ice cream as an item that you should be ingesting. So
Yeah, it was a great chat with Jen. I learned a lot from that, having someone who has the actual knowledge from a dietitian's background and providing real information. You can really tell that the information she was providing was high level, and working with someone like that would be something that would be extremely helpful to dial in nutrition, which is one of the most important things when it comes to ultra running, and also one of the most difficult things to dial in.
Yeah, the conversation was great, Simon. I appreciated that the two of you really vibed over the scientific aspects of nutrition. You guys really kind of clicked there. It was really interesting to sit back and listen to both sides of the story.
Yeah, we're nerds. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Pretty much. But without further ado, our conversation with Jen from Active Fueling Nutrition Coaching. Check her website out, and all the information will be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the show. Hi, Jen. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Could you share with us a little bit about your coaching business and Active Fueling Nutrition and what it's all about?
Yeah, so Active Fueling Nutrition Coaching is an online sports nutrition coaching company that I've been doing since about 2019. But prior to a little history of me, kind of how I got into sports nutrition, I'm primarily an endurance athlete. That's primarily what I work with, although I work with all sorts of athletes. But kind of got inspired to go the sports nutrition route when my family took a trip to France for the 2004 Tour de France. And it was one of those trips where you did the rides and then you watched the tour come through. So I was doing some of the big classic French Alp climbs and definitely bonked. I learned the hard way sort of about fueling and what it takes to get up those climbs. And that sort of inspired me to think more about like how important fueling actually is when it comes to sports. So kind of went the sports nutrition route in school, and then came to Active Fueling in 2019 as a dietitian, but not my company. It was started by a different sports dietitian who eventually moved out of the company, and I took over. So it has been my private practice since 2021, and has been virtual since COVID. That's kind of what inspired the COVID, but that allowed me to move to the mountains and kind of live by the trails and still work with people in the city, and all over the country, really. So
That sounds like such a great trajectory. And gosh, I think those were '04. Seems like it was like the Lance Armstrong era years. What was the best climb that you did in your bike ride?
So Alpe d'Huez is one of the classic climbs that you've probably heard of. They've done like time trials up that, even so hard, so many switchbacks to the top. I literally thought I was going to tip over. I was going so slow, cranking my wheel up at that time. But it's beautiful, and there's so many people. Like there was literally 1 million people there, I think, the day that we watched the tour come through Alpe d'Huez. So it's really cool energy as well. But it's gorgeous. I highly recommend it for anyone who's able to get over there and experience it.
That's so cool. You got to experience that. I'm a huge cycling fan.
Yeah.
And and
Nice.
that is on the bucket list of things to do. I think though I might go
Yeah.
to the Giro d'Italia first before the Tour de France, but that's just me.
Yeah.
A little
Yeah.
bit more about your coaching, Jen.
Yeah.
How does it work to coach athletes online in nutrition? I know I coach
Yeah.
athletes in exercise and I use smartwatches, but how does that work in the nutrition role?
So we meet virtually, we meet over Zoom. So it's very similar to meeting with a dietitian face to face. I'm just my face is on a computer, so you can meet with me anywhere, which honestly makes it easier logistically because I can't do like in-person body fat measurements or that kind of stuff. Like I'm not going to take a weight, someone's going to have to take it for me and send it to me. But otherwise, the online part doesn't really impact it. But how my coaching model works is sort of like a package model where you sign up, we do an initial assessment, which is where I get to know my clients and we really dig into what does your current nutrition look like, what's your training look like, and what are your goals. And then we sort of build a plan from there. And I always start by focusing on the daily nutrition before we dive into the sports nutrition because my philosophy is it doesn't really matter if you're doing everything. I mean, it matters, but even if you're doing everything right during your races and your training, if your day to day nutrition doesn't support your activity level and your goals, you're not going to optimize your performance, right? And that's really what it's about is optimizing performance is why people usually come to me. So we kind of start by focusing on day-to-day nutrition. How do we make sure you're meeting your goals? And for some people that might be calorie and macro tracking. For others it's I create meal plans sometimes if that's helpful, or sometimes we do it more intuitively, like watching portions. And then we dive into the sports nutrition stuff. So once you got that foundation and you feel good about your day-to-day habits, then we sort of start to dial in the sports nutrition. So, fueling, hydration, electrolytes, what does that need to look like before, during, and after for recovery and performance, depending on the sport. And then we always put together a game day plan as well. So you want to make sure that going into a race, you have all those pieces together, you have a plan so you don't have to think about it on race day or the days leading up to it as well. So I always like to do a little called game day planning where we sort of think about that week leading up to a race and what do you need to be doing to show up at the start line ready as possible.
I love the approach. I love the approach of kind of not just focusing on race day, but also during the training and just your day-to-day life. That's really,
Yeah.
and when you think about it, you're training all year for a one-day event. And obviously what you do for 364 days is really important. What I'm curious, as someone who's never had a coach or kind of coaching session in nutrition either, is
Yeah.
how long do you work with your client to achieve their goal?
So it really depends on the client and what their goal is, right? So if someone comes to me with a body comp goal, that usually takes longer, right? Versus someone who's maybe their day-to-day nutrition is pretty good and we're kind of just like fine tuning, it might be a little shorter. So that's something we figure out during the initial assessment is kind of like, are we looking at 8 weeks? Are we looking at 16 weeks? And I have various packages based off of that. But I work with someone as long as they need me, right? So until they feel good about doing it on their own, I'm here as a resource. And we check in, some people I meet weekly, some every other week. And then often we go down to just once a month, touching base and kind of seeing how things are going, maybe meet right before a race. If there's things to finalize. So it's really individualized. That's kind of the biggest key, I think, is that I try to individualize it to the person, what their race goals are, and what their like level of accountability and support they need. Because for a lot of people, they know what they need to be doing, but implementation is a lot harder. So it helps to have a nutrition coach to kind of help work through the roadblocks or the mental barriers that sometimes get in the way of doing what we know we need to do. So again, it's very individualized, kind of depending on the person. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and fitness is definitely, or whatever the goal is definitely a journey. Where,
Right.
who do you think is the right, or what is the right time to go and approach you for these session?
Again, depends on the goal, but not right before your race. I have so many like athletes that come to me and the race is a month off and I'm like, we don't have enough time to do everything because, just even dialing in the day-to-day nutrition is a weeks long process. So I would say like preseason is good. Or even the off season, like especially if you have body comp goals, obviously we don't want to sacrifice performance. I never recommend working on a body comp goal during your racing season. So I would say like towards the end of your off season, like preseason, you're just starting to get into your training. That is a better time. Don't wait till right before the race because that doesn't give us enough time to like really perfect everything.
I laugh, Jen, because I get
Yeah.
athletes that do the same thing. They have 104
Yeah.
weeks and they want to know how I can help them get there. That's really interesting. I appreciate the approach as well. I can totally relate. It sounds just like the coaching that I do online as well. It's more similar
Yeah.
than I would have actually
Yeah.
thought it would have been. So
Yeah.
And what are typical problems that you see in your practice? Because I
Yeah.
would assume that people that come to you, they're facing specific issues, and
Yeah.
you're trying to resolve that, right?
It depends. Sometimes people are just like, I don't know how to eat. Like, tell me how to eat, right? Like, I don't know what I should be eating. I don't know how much I should be eating. That's what a lot of it is. But then there's also a lot, especially in the endurance athlete community. There's a lot of people who know I'm not getting enough. Like, I know I'm not supporting my activity level. I need to figure out how to do it. And then gut issues is another huge one, right? That's so common, especially with the ultra distances. But even shorter distances like marathon or even half marathon level, a lot of people come just feeling like they don't feel good, or they're running for the porta potty. So gut issues is probably a big one too.
Yeah, I mean, I always say there's two type of ultra runner. There's the pooper and the puker, and there's
Yeah,
literally
it's coming
nobody
out
that
one
is
end.
not. Yeah, exactly. It's coming out, so it's best to be a pooper. That's my view. But Brian,
Yeah.
which one are you actually?
I'm gonna plead the fifth. I don't think I'm either. Quite honestly, I'm probably the worst at
You're
this because
lucky.
That
I'm
sounds like a
lucky.
puker to me.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely not a puker for sure. I'm not. Actually have an iron gut. I'm fortunate enough to have an iron
Yeah,
gut, and that gets me through.
that's good. Yeah, neither one is fun, but can indicate different GI issues, right? Like if
Yeah.
it's more nausea, can be more, of what you're eating more immediately, versus the diarrhea stuff can be more, electrolyte fluid imbalance, or
Mm.
something that happens sooner. So, but yeah, it does seem to fall into those two categories.
And how would you approach that? Like I assume it's some level of problem solving. So let's
Hmm.
say I come to you and I guess I just said it. I'm a pooper.
Yeah.
So help me, please. Like what would you do? And it's
So
definitely
for
a race day thing, but yeah.
Yeah. So even if it's just a race day thing, again, always still start looking at the daily nutrition. Are you getting enough?
Mm.
Because a lot of people don't factor in that chronic underfueling affects your GI system. The way I like to describe it is your gut is like any other muscle in your body. And if it's not properly exercised, i.e., you don't get enough nutrition on a daily basis, it's not functioning optimally. The same way, if you never used your bicep, it would wither away. It's sort of the same with your gut. It's not getting enough food, it's not as strong as it needs to be. So we would look at your daily nutrition. Are you getting enough? And if not, we would need to, increase your intake, maybe slowly over time, to make sure you're getting enough and the right balance, right, of macros, to support your training level. And then we kind of look at what are you doing leading up to the race. So like the days before, even, are you eating a lot of fiber foods? That kind of stuff
Mm.
can affect it. You want to be careful about that those days leading up to the race. And then race day and during too, we want to look at what products are you using? Is it sports nutrition products? They're too concentrated? Is it your fluid or electrolyte balance is off? Fluids and electrolytes are one of the bigger issues, I would say, that people either they're getting the balance is off, right? They're not getting enough hydration, or they're getting too much, or maybe they're getting enough water, but too much sodium, not enough sodium. So we kind of dial that in. I do sweat rate tests with my clients where we just have them go, do a run. We do some measurements of how much fluid they're losing, and we try to dial in
Mm.
their fluid loss based off that. But then we're still sort of guessing. Like I give general recommendations for sodium,
Yeah.
and then we fine tune it based off how they're doing, right? So you can go. There are companies where you can go and like wear a patch and like go for a run, and they can actually tell you how much salt you're losing, which can be helpful, if like the basic stuff doesn't cover it, to see maybe you're like a super salty sweater and we just didn't know it. That can cause a lot of GI stuff. So, but kind of we start by sort of looking at, okay, like these are the general recommendation targets. How does what
Yeah.
you do compare to that? And then how do we need to tweak it for the individual athlete too? If
Yeah,
that
and I
kind of
think
makes
that's really
sense.
the value of having a personalized coach or something, is that you'll always have more general advice, and then
Yeah.
how do you apply it? Like if it works, great, and it's going to work for some people, but
Right.
obviously not for everyone. And then you have
Right.
experience in a kind of clinical approach to that, or I don't know if
Yeah.
clinical is the term, but
Yeah.
there's an art to it, which I respect a lot for
Yes.
sure. I mean,
For
for me,
sure.
the salt pills, quite frankly, I just pop them when it feels right.
Yeah.
There's no science there.
Right.
I've never taken one by itself. It's always two at a time. So
Ooh,
that's also,
that might be a lot of salt, right? So we would want to look at like how many milligrams are you actually getting. That could be contributing to the GI stuff, right? So especially if you're not getting enough water with it, you always got to think
yeah.
about that
I think it's
ratio.
the sugar
Mhm.
for me though. I think like
Yeah.
I definitely fuel with gel and sports drink a lot at the beginning.
Yeah.
And my gut can sustain that, but when we're in the 15-hour or plus, at some point, I
The gut
know it's
starts to
like,
shut down. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I'm like, yep, it's time to switch to something else.
Yeah, our community tends to
And those,
lean towards sugary products at the aid stations, and
yeah.
and it just kind of
Well, the sports nutrition products are
exasperates it. Yeah.
convenient, right? Yeah, it can, right? So you have to look at the concentration. Like some of those, you're getting such a large dose of carbs at a time, it
Yeah.
might be too much for your gut. And they use like different gels use actually different sources of carbohydrates. So you want to kind of
Mhm.
look at like, are you using one that maybe doesn't sit with your well with your gut, and another product works better? Um, but this is why you always got to experiment with all this stuff in training, right? You know, the
Mhm.
number one rule: never try anything new on race day. Um,
No, totally. And as you
yeah.
said, the day-to-day food is pretty important. I'm
Yep.
curious, what's your view on a lot of people, or kind of something that's trendy, is saying that you're fat adapted and adapting
Oh,
their diet for that. Do you have an
yeah.
opinion?
Yeah, I don't tend to promote that. I know that
Mm.
that's can be big in the ultra community. It seems like it was bigger and it's died down a little bit, but basically the
Diets.
concept is so when we run, we're always burning a mixture of carbs and fat, right? And carbs is the limiting source. Our bodies can only store enough carbohydrate really for like 2-ish hours of intense exercise, which isn't nearly enough, right? Even the
Yeah.
leanest athlete has enough fat stores to go forever, not forever, but for a long time, right? So carbs is always the limiting source, but a lot of people, their gut can't tolerate enough carbs, right? So they want to look at, okay, can I make myself more adapted to fat so that I don't need as much carbohydrate when I'm exercising? And to some extent, you can by pushing like a really high fat diet and training fasted. But what we've seen is it doesn't really help with performance. So if it's coming from just a pure performance standpoint, I don't really recommend it. If it's coming from like I have so much GI issues during my races and I want to work on that, we would still want to cover the basics first. Like, well, let's look at what are you doing? Maybe we just need to make some tweaks there. Like it's a very extreme diet, especially the people that want to go
Mhm.
keto. You have to be consistently low fat all the time. As soon as you start eating a bunch of carbs, you get out of ketosis. And I also worry about just like the long-term health benefits. I've known athletes that
Yeah.
have done that and they burn out, right? Their bodies can't handle it after a certain amount of time. I don't think that it's a survival mechanism, right? So when our body doesn't have carbohydrates, we can make ketones so that we can survive. But is it how our bodies are meant to function? My
Yeah.
personal belief is no, right? So
Yeah, it's a huge
Yeah,
hot
and
topic in
there's
the space. Yeah, it's pretty
yeah,
crazy that it's a huge hot topic.
and I feel, and I like your answer. I'm a scientist by background
yeah.
and like biochemistry and these
Oh,
things. Like it
nice.
feels good to hear a little bit of it. And you hear a lot of pseudoscience sometimes in running,
Yeah,
and you're like, yeah, that's not really how the body works. But I
right,
think also that you bring a good point that people don't necessarily think about the long term consequence. And
right.
if you're a
Yeah,
pro runner, okay, maybe, but as an average runner, do you really want to push everything that could lead to dyslipidemia in general? I
right,
don't know that's necessarily a great thing to do.
right. Yeah,
So it's
totally.
kind of scary. I mean, there's a lot
Yeah,
of, or there's potentially a heart problem with these sorts of sports. And if you, on top of that, modify your diet to an extreme,
right. Is it worth it for?
yeah,
Yeah.
for a mid pack finish,
Right. Yeah, just to say you
for a
finished.
belt buckle,
That is a
yeah,
great question. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Jen, you kind of answered Simon's question about his particular issue being the pooper, as he
Yeah.
described it. But what about the
Yes.
puker? What about the other end of that coin? What suggestions do you have for the puker that has a hard time keeping stuff down during the event?
So so starting with the same thing, the puking I feel like is less of the underfueling than the diarrhea, but it's funny we're just talking about these things, but dietitians talk about poop a lot, so it's okay. But still looking at the daily nutrition and still looking at what are you eating during your races and like leading up to your race, and is that contributing, especially like the concentrated carbs that we talked about. I feel like that can really contribute to it if you're getting too many gels or the the percentage is too high, like the concentration of carbohydrates are not getting enough fluids with it. So we look at that and also look at a little bit of nausea management, right? Like utilizing peppermint, ginger chews, those
Hmm.
types of things to help manage nausea because sometimes it's a little bit is almost inevitable, right? But we don't want you to be
Mhm.
puking. And then I'm kind of having a plan too for if you do like rehydrating, right? Because that's the
yeah.
danger with that is usually you feel better after it happens, but you've lost a lot of fluids and electrolytes, which is now you're like playing catch up. So kind of making a plan for that as well. Um, And also talking about training the gut. We haven't really talked to that, but like you can actually train your gut, not in the middle of a race, but this is why it's so important to come with enough time for us to work on stuff, is that you can train your gut to tolerate more food, but it's a very slow process, right? So if we have enough time, we can kind of work on, which runs does it make sense, and what can we start eating, what can we try out to sort of train your gut to tolerate more, and that can be really helpful too. In addition to, like I said, dialing in the numbers, right? Making sure like the amounts of carbs, the amount of fluids, the amount of electrolytes, that those are all kind of where we think they need to be as well.
So what kind of exercise would you recommend specifically for someone training their gut in training?
So training your gut basically is like increasing the amount of nutrition that you're doing on your run. And you
Mhm.
start with like, it depends on what the person can already tolerate, right? Like we know people that can eat burritos and go sprint and they're fine, right? Those people don't need to, their gut is trained versus the people that they're like, they get cramps, they get diarrhea, they get nausea, no matter what. So we start with like the simplest thing. So for a lot of people, it could even be like juice or a banana is a common thing that I recommend. And so we start with a small amount, again, individualized based off how much you can tolerate, and eating it like as close to the run as possible, and then eating small amounts during the run. I usually recommend like picking like a middle distance run to do the training your gut, because you don't want to like ruin your long run. So that's the danger too, is like you don't want to like feel terrible, not get your long run in. So kind of choosing what type of run is it okay if you don't feel good in, maybe not like a key workout, and then again, like I said, just starting with the simplest thing and then slowly working our way up to like more different kinds of solid foods, different kinds of carbs, and training your gut to tolerate more, knowing that you might have to go a little slower in the beginning. You might not be able to push the pace as much when you're training your gut, but eventually you will be able to.
Yeah, that's interesting because it almost sounds like you have a cheat sheet of list of what's hard to digest and what's not.
Well, yeah,
And
we
you
we do
start
know,
them and
like,
like,
yeah, simple carbs are going to be the easiest, right? So we start with those, and then we might get a little bit more complex carbs versus fat and protein are going to be the hardest things to digest. So like holding
yeah.
off on those until we know you can do the other stuff. Yeah.
But it's tricky too because then it's a matter of amount. And
Yep.
and I guess I'm thinking wrong about it, but I'm always avoiding high fat
Yeah.
content and high protein, thinking, the protein and building back, I'll do that in my recovery phase.
Yeah.
While I'm running, I'm taking sugar, and it
Yeah.
doesn't sound healthy for sure. Like I drink Coke and like it's just working instead of
Yeah.
trying like your approach of, okay, like let's go. Well, maybe not burrito. Apparently, that's
No, no.
the highest of the list,
Yeah.
but maybe there's something in between that I should try to
Yeah.
have in my
Yeah.
diet.
Yeah, because a little fat and protein, especially during the ultra distances, can be helpful, right?
Mm.
Mhm.
One for for just feeling satisfied, like those that do races and just do gels, like you can eat gels and still feel hungry almost, right? Even though you're getting the
Mhm.
energy you need from sugar,
Yeah.
you almost still feel hungry, which can be uncomfortable. And then there's also flavor fatigue, right? Like after 100 miles of gels, like it makes you feel nauseous probably just getting down another gel, versus if you can kind of get used to, like, I'm eating some fig bars or some pretzels, some potato chips, some foods that are still primarily carbs but have a little bit of
Yeah.
protein and fat, like it sounds more palatable, right? Too, so it can help with that as well. But yeah, a little bit of protein and fat in the longer distances is okay, but you're right to keep it more minimal, right?
Yeah. And there's definitely also a psychosomatic aspect to it.
Yeah.
Just you mentioning the gel thing, I was like, I'm fine eating gel for a long time, but the orange flavored gel, there's one time I did the mistake of having way too many of that one. And now just thinking about it, I'm like, ooh,
Yeah, never
ooh,
again.
not feeling great right now. So got to be careful with that.
Yeah,
Well, that's
I
really
have
interesting.
my bad associations with certain things too.
Yeah, my wife is
Jen.
a cherry flavor, and it's because the antibiotic was cherry flavored. So she remembers being sick when she was a kid, and now just the
Mhm.
cherry flavored gummies
It's like
is
medicine. Yeah.
yeah, it comes out quickly. Let's just say it like
Yeah.
that.
Jen, Simon and I will be running the 250-mile Cocodona race here in the first week
Oh,
of May.
nice.
Um, maybe
Okay.
not together, but together. but
Yeah.
I've done 240 before, but Simon hasn't gone that far. Simon's
Yeah.
gone, I think, 140 or
Okay.
roughly. And I do
135.
see in what I've done before at other events, I do see where there's a huge benefit. I've had like scrambled egg burritos, quite honestly, at aid stations, and they
Yeah.
intentionally serve those things just to
Yeah.
kind of give you some
Yeah.
substance and make you feel
Yeah.
full and the sensation of fullness.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then I'm eating all the granola bars throughout between aid stations, but I'm
Yeah,
really
the
kind of,
carbs. Yep.
I'm eating the carbs, and they're light and easy to carry throughout,
Yeah.
between aid stations, but I'm eating heavy at the aid stations. I'm eating the
Which
cheeseburgers and
is good.
bacon and those
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Which I think people don't factor in, especially when you're talking like 200 plus miles, like you're running through so many meals that you're missing, right?
Hmm.
So if you're only fueling for like the run portion, like you miss lunch, you miss breakfast, you miss dinner. So you kind of do have to factor in like stopping and actually getting in enough calories to count for that as well when you're doing those really super long distances. And you're not going as well. I don't know. Some people do those incredibly fast, but the
Uh,
slower you go, the easier it is on the gut too, right? So your gut can tolerate more if you're, going more of a moderate pace versus like a marathon, right? Nobody's probably eating a burrito during a marathon because we're pushing the pace.
Yeah, and that's very true because that's something that I tell people a lot is if you're starting to have problem digesting in a race, just slow down. It's worth slowing down to
Hmm.
get
Yeah.
the calories in because it's a matter of your body's prioritizing blood flow to your muscle, to your
Yep.
lungs. So your gut, your body's thinking, hey, like we'll do that later. It's
Yeah.
just that later
Yep.
is in 30 hours and
Yeah.
yeah, it's too late. So slowing
Yeah.
down is a great tip. It's just yeah, like you
Yeah.
say, in a marathon where you're running fast, not happening. But for
No.
Cocodona, I'm definitely planning to.
Yeah, and think about fueling
Yeah,
at weird times too. Like I know a lot of people with ultras, they'll like train at night because most of us for shorter distances, we're not. I don't run at night, right? So, but you will be, right? So training like running at night and eating at night because your gut's not used to that either, right? You're used to
Hmm.
like 12, 15-hour fast overnight. So kind of practicing with that so that that's not unfamiliar to you as well.
That's a great tip,
yeah.
actually.
There's definitely a circadian
Yeah.
cycle happening. But I think I would be curious actually for a study to measure that um, kind of cortisol level if like when we run through the night if there's still a peak or and a drop or not because I actually
Oh,
feel it. I feel that around like midnight I really struggle, and then when a little bit before the morning comes I'm much better all of a sudden with food. um
interesting. Yeah,
so
could be. Yeah.
yeah, it could be. I mean, it's definitely involved in like glucose metabolism and all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone has their dark moment in an overnight event. And mine is not the same time as Simon's at midnight. I tend to just before sunrise, that 4:45 to 5:30
Yeah.
a.m. Is the toughest time for me. That's the struggle bus where I'm at
Yeah.
to do all functions. Quite honestly, to move forward and to eat and to hydrate. So yeah,
Yes, you got to practice pushing it even when you don't want to, and then it gets easier when the sun comes
I
up.
wanted to talk a little bit about nutrition and training. Um,
Okay.
Nutrition on race day versus recovery and what that might look like, Jen. So we talked a little bit about like in the event and some of the ways that we can kind of help the gut, depending on if you're the pooper or the puker. But what about like recovery? What should we be fueling on after our big workout, after our events? What does that look like?
So recovery, you want to think a few things. You want to think carbohydrates, right? We want to replace the carbohydrate stores that we've burned off or emptied, like our glycogen stores. Protein for muscle recovery and repair, but also fluid and electrolytes, right? You're probably in a deficit, especially for these longer events. So kind of keep those few things in mind, and keep in mind the sooner the better to start the recovery process. A lot of people I know, myself included, like stomach does not feel good after a race, and so it's hard. So
Hmm.
kind of think about like what sounds good, what can you do just to get calories in. I literally used to do Mountain Dew and Cheetos after some of my races because I like to run at altitude, and altitude kind of makes your stomach feel gross too, but the bubbly and the salty tasted good to me, and it's carbs, right? So
Hmm.
it's kind of starting replacing my glycogen, even though it's not maybe the optimal thing. But the sooner the better for replacing it, and then like eating regularly. So especially after these big events, it's not like one meal and you're recovered. You're recovering for days, some weeks, after these really big events. So making sure that you're continuing to like focus on like high quality protein and carbohydrates, like eating regularly for like the days after the event as well, is super important. But definitely protein is the big one. Like when we think carbs with the races, but protein for recovery is huge.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting actually to think about the cycle of recovery because it's true. I mean, electrolyte and fluid, you're depleted after the race, but I always felt that this
Yeah.
is something within a day I'm good, like I'm rebalanced.
Yeah.
Protein will take forever because I'm building back muscle, and
Yeah.
sugar is probably in between, like building back glycogen slowly. It's probably not a one day thing, but probably
Yeah.
not also a full week.
Yeah, but you're exactly right. Like the muscle breakdown, right? That it takes longer for that's probably the thing that takes the longest to come back.
Yeah.
And there are certain proteins that are going to be a little better for that. Like leucine, you might have heard, an amino acid that's really good for muscle protein synthesis. It's found in animal products and like dairy. So kind of incorporating that kind of stuff too can help as well.
Any source for vegan, which is also a hot topic in ultra running?
Yeah, I mean, I think then you might be more reliant on like the supplement stuff, like
Mm,
the protein powders where they add amino acids in for it, but and a balanced diet, right? So
yeah.
getting enough variety so that you can find the right balance of amino acids, but it's a little bit harder with a vegan diet for sure. You have to, I think, focus a little bit more on getting protein in.
I feel like athletes at the finish line, including myself, have always been told like there's a window, like a 45-minute window where you should try to get as much nutrient as possible to replenish those stores, just
Yeah.
like you had mentioned. But I also think that there's a point to where the general public feels like that when that window closes, it closes and goes away. And it's really not the case. It just kind of
Yeah.
diminishes, right?
No.
Like the window starts to diminish.
Yeah.
So even if it's an hour
Yep.
afterwards and you had to drive somewhere to get food, like it's still important to refuel and hydrate all
Oh yeah.
your needs, right?
Yeah, that's what I tell my clients. Like, it's optimal to do it within 45 minutes or as soon as possible, but it's as soon as you can, right? So if it's an hour until you can get to food, I would say let's plan better next time though and bring something with you, right? If you know it's going to be an hour till you get somewhere, but if your stomach like really can't handle it, like what can you sip on? Can you sip on a sports drink, an electrolyte drink, the bare minimum? Anything is better than nothing. But yeah, it's not like the window shuts and you can't recover, like all is lost. It's just you didn't optimize it and it might take a little longer now, but you still definitely need to focus on it.
And conceptually, I think they probably demonstrated that in the study, and they use 45 minutes. That would be my guess as to where the recommendation origin from.
Yeah.
I mean, you would know better, but for me, conceptually, I try to do it as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Like if it's 5 minutes, like I have my protein shake or whatever, and we're thinking more training. Like after a race, I'm not able to do that, but after
Yeah.
a training run, especially a long run, like I have it ready and I'll take it right away.
Yeah. Yeah. The sooner the better. We should say within 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Don't wait 45 minutes. If you're hungry,
Mm.
if your stomach feels good, like do it in 5 minutes for sure.
Yeah. Because there's a delay anyway between like drinking
By the time it
amino
gets to
acid
your,
and then like actually absorbing and then going into the
yeah,
muscle and like building
for
that.
sure.
So,
Yeah, you have to digest it.
and I'm a big fan of smoothies myself.
Yeah.
It's everything is like kind of inside. It's like good, like
And liquids are,
protein,
yeah.
liquids, and yeah,
Yeah,
easy to
liquids are easier
digest.
to digest. Yep. So that's a common recommendation for me too, right? Just get a scoop of protein powder, get some fruit for carbs.
It's practical because you have your protein
Mhm.
supplement, which
Yeah.
actually I'm curious about that one too, Jen. What's your take on source of amino acid? Do you think the supplements are not as good as if you would take it more naturally through meats or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always tend to err on like real food better than supplements just because you're getting like a mixed package, right? With real food, you're
Mm.
getting not just getting amino acids, you're getting all these other things with it. And a lot of nutrients sort of like work together to support each other versus like when you isolate and you're just taking an amino acid supplement. But a lot of people, that's just not realistic to eat like solid food or they're not going to eat a sandwich right after. Maybe it's a convenience thing. So I think, supplements have their place, but real food is always preferable if it's feasible, whether that's like the logistics of you're at a trailhead in the middle of nowhere or if it's, your gut can't handle it, but food first for sure.
Yeah, carrying
So,
your steak and cooking
Yeah.
it quickly,
Yeah, your little
making
food
it rare
rest.
because you have only 45
Yeah.
minutes. Like you have to cook it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so Simon made a comment about he's taken 2 salt pills at an aid station before he moves on.
Yeah.
And to go just back to the thread that we were just on, is I don't actually use salt pills, and that's just one of the differences between Simon and I. But
Yeah.
again, should we be supplementing that like in a salt pill, or should we be trying, if at all possible, finding it naturally in food or adding it to food that we're eating at the aid
I
station?
think definitely doesn't have to be a salt pill, especially because a lot of those have so much salt at a time. You got to be careful you're not overdoing it as well. I think that a lot of times it's so sodium and salt aren't quite the same. I know sometimes you use them interchangeably, but sodium is going to be the main thing that you lose during sweat. And most people probably are going to need to replace sodium via like an electrolyte drink or something like that, unless you're really salting your food. Or some sports nutrition products put a lot of sodium in their food as well. The the problem is if you're just like salting your food, you're just probably guessing about how much you're getting, right? Unless you got your little teaspoon out there and you're kind of like sprinkling it on and you know how much you're getting. So you would have to be a little bit careful with that. Um, the general recommendation you guys have probably heard is like 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium an hour, but that's
Mm.
real give or take, right? A salty sweater could
Yeah.
lose significantly more than that. But that's not a too hard of a number to hit with like a combination of sports nutrition products. If you're eating a salty food like a pretzel or a potato chip and then like an electrolyte drink is a pretty easy number to hit versus the salt tabs, a lot of them have like 1,000
Yeah,
in
it's a
them. And I
gram.
think that those are more for like if you're playing catch up. Like I've definitely been in a
Hmm.
race where I was like, my stomach feels gross. I think my lectures are off. I take a salt tab. I feel better because I'm already in a deficit, but it's better to sort of try and stay on top of it, right? And not get to that point.
Yeah, I mean, my default myself is to go with the sports drink, which
Yeah.
has electrolyte. But then if it's a desert race and you're sweating a lot, I measured
Yeah.
the volume of sweat I can produce, and
Yeah.
amazingly, I'm a very good sweater. I'm very well
Yeah.
trained for that when I'm heat adapted, and at some point it's just not possible to kind of keep
Yeah.
going. So then that's where I kind of pop to, and I actually, you're
Yeah.
right. Like I know at that time, like I'm falling behind. I'm starting to be a little foggy. I'm probably dehydrated, and I probably lost
Yeah.
too much salt. So I'm just like, pop, let's take
Yeah.
two and pretend that it's gonna work. I
Yeah.
have no clue.
It probably helps, right? But like you said, you want to try to if you're a heavy sweater, it's really hard to play catch up or to like stay even. So you might look at there's like hypohydration products that some people will
Mm,
take to try to like retain more fluids even going into the race, taking it the night before, the morning before. So there are like
that's
strategies
true.
if you know you're a heavy sweater, or some people are salty sweaters. And so they maybe don't even sweat a ton, but it's just like the concentration of salt is so much
Yeah.
higher. So those people have to be a little more careful too.
Yeah, I was looking into that a little bit ahead of bad water. I
Yeah.
decided that simple was better, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the one where
Okay.
you would sweat a lot.
That is true, and it's funny because it's super dry there, so
It's a dry
you're
heat,
Yeah.
right?
dry. It's
Yeah.
dry heat,
Dry
and
heat's
like it's
fine.
it's 120, so it's like you feel
Oh,
dry, but you know that you're losing so much.
yeah.
Jen, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what our daily nutrition should be looking like in the everyday. So we talked a lot about like the training
Yeah.
process, racing, and what that looks like when we're in our event, in our sport.
Mhm.
But what does it look like outside
Yeah.
of that? What am I eating too much? Am I eating too little? Where
Yeah. So daily nutrition, I mean, I can't tell you if you're eating too much or too little without like looking at you and your specific diet, right? And comparing it to your
Mm,
activity level. You can go by hunger fullness cues, but there's so much that impacts it, right? Exercise blunts hunger. Like a lot of people aren't hungry right after exercise, so you got to be careful with that. I would say generally focus on like eating regularly. Like as an athlete, like we should be eating every 2 to 4 hours. We should not be going super long periods of time without eating, including a protein source every time. Part of that is to make sure that you're getting enough protein in your diet. And part of it is also just the optimal way is to like sort of dose your protein over the day, like 20, 30 grams per meal versus like, no protein at lunch and like a 60-gram steak at dinner. It's better to be a little more even split
true.
out. Obviously, lots of fruits and veggies. That's something I think most people don't get enough of, for the antioxidants and vitamins and minerals and all that. And then also, um, think about your gut health, right? We talked a lot about gut issues. We want to make sure our guts are healthy on a day-to-day basis. So that's like getting in probiotic food and prebiotic foods, which probiotics, you probably heard like, a lot of yogurts have them, or kombucha, fermented foods like miso or kimchi. And then prebiotics come a lot in the fruits and veggies too, and those support the probiotics. So kind of thinking about your gut health on a day-to-day basis can help with the gut training during as well. But also I'd say, yeah, make sure you're eating enough, right? Like we should be leaving our meals feeling satisfied. We should have good energy levels over the course of the day. We should have like, we shouldn't be getting like extremely hungry. Like if you're getting starving and you're wanting to like overeat a bunch of food later in the day, that's usually a sign that you didn't get enough of something earlier. So kind of listening to what your body's telling you in terms of like cravings and that kind of stuff too is good.
I look at my body weight, and if it's going down or going up, then I know
Yeah.
that I've been eating too much or too little in the past. But I guess there's more science to it than just that.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
But what about people that are trying to lose weight?
Yeah. So again, I never want my athletes to focus on weight loss during their racing season because
Yeah.
we don't want to sacrifice performance, right? So we need to be looking at like the optimal time. And I am very big on like, I don't believe in diets, right? Because they're not sustainable. And also like, I believe that if your training is where it needs to be and your nutrition is where it needs to be, like a lot of times the body comp stuff will kind of come on its own, with little tweaks, right? Versus dramatic things. That being said, sometimes we'll create like a small calorie deficit to work on body comp, but not as much as you would think, right? Like a pretty small one for very slow weight loss with athletes is what I recommend, so that they have good energy levels, and also just to like keep our relationship with food good, right? So I'm very
Yes.
much of a no good or bad foods, like everything fits. It's just kind of a matter of, some foods are more productive to sports nutrition than others, and timing comes into it. But like if you like ice cream, like we'll work it in, right? That's okay. Like it can have a spot, because if you feel like deprived because you're working on body comp goals, you're more likely to be like overthinking it. It kind of affects your mental health, or you're more likely to overeat when you are confronted with that food. So, um, we have to be very careful, I think, with the body comp goals, that we're still, allowing ourselves to enjoy food, that we're still like eating enough to feel well, and just creating a really small deficit to work on the goal. So it's a long-term goal.
Yeah, for sure. And you're so right. I think we have a complex relationship with food and like
Yeah.
health, and it needs to stay healthy. Losing weight might be a healthy thing, but if you're doing it in an unhealthy manner or something that is not sustainable, well, it's
Yeah.
actually not healthy. Myself, I
Right.
think I was like doing like 200-300 calorie deficit,
Yeah.
which was, my weight loss was very, very slow, but at least I was still able to
Yeah.
train.
That's the range that I recommend usually, actually. So,
Yeah, it's just
yeah.
difficult to be accurate.
Yeah,
You
it's
probably
gonna
have
be.
better recommendation, because for me, I'll use what my watch think I burn during my run, and I don't know if it's accurate. And
Yeah.
a 10% difference would probably make the difference between where I'm in calorie deficit or I'm in surplus. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it's always a little bit of a guessing game, and kind of
mm,
just being patient with the process, because we can use our best tools to analyze, like you said, your watch. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but neither are food labels, like
yeah,
you go to the restaurant, you order the food, it says it's 500 calories. Well, that's assuming they made it exactly like the original recipe. There's going to be some variations, and there's even little variations. Like I remember reading a study about almonds, and they were saying when you eat 200 calories of almonds, your body actually is only digesting 170 or something like that, just because of how we break it down. And there's the energy to break down food. So it's important not to get overly focused on calories
yeah,
anyway, right? To kind of focus on like, are you eating well? Are you eating to support your activity level? And maybe you dial it back a little. You're eating till you're satisfied, not full, but not worrying about every last calorie, right? Because you're gonna drive yourself crazy, and they're not gonna be totally accurate anyway.
Then you said that active athletes, us ultra runners, as ultra runners, that we should be eating 2-3 hours, maybe more like snacking or grazing. I would associate that with.
Yeah.
Where does like fasting or intermittent fasting kind of fit, or does it fit?
Yeah.
And is there a space for it? And is it for an ultra runner?
Yeah. So I'll back up. It's more like structured meals and snacks than grazing, I would say. Because to me, grazing is like just grabbing a handful here, a handful there,
Mm,
versus like eating every 2 to 4 hours is still like a meal, a snack, a meal, a snack. Have some more structure to it, right? Make sure it's balanced every time. Um, when it comes to intermittent fasting, I think it depends on what are your goals for it. I don't know that there's like a lot of performance benefit to intermittent fasting. I think where people see a benefit is like overall health benefits, like they say, it's good for our guts to get their rest, or it's good for our cells to like eat off the dead cells, for that kind of thing. So it kind of depends on what you're going for, but also being careful with like, can you fit intermittent fasting in? Well, I don't really like it during the course of a day. Where I think
mhm,
it can work in is like an overnight, like you give yourself 15 hours between your
mm,
like last meal of the day and your
mm,
breakfast, not necessarily fasting during the day, just because like we're saying, you have to eat regularly to be recovering from these really tough workouts, right? So if you did a real tough workout and your body's recovering for weeks, but you like fasted half the day, I feel like it's a missed opportunity to be getting like the protein and carbs that your body needed. So I think being careful with it, depending on where you are in your season, like are you going to be able to recover from your races? Are you going to be able to get in enough, right? Like a lot of people use intermittent fasting for weight loss. It's not magical for that. It's because if you're only eating out of 6 hours out of the day, it's hard to get enough calories in, right? So as an endurance athlete, we're actually trying to get in enough calories. So if we're limiting the hours that we can get it in, I think it's harder, right? Or then you're eating this like giant meal meal that's going to cause GI distress. So I think I'm not a huge fan of it for endurance athletes. It can have a small spot, but it's definitely not my go-to, right? I don't think it's going to, like I said, fix your performance, or there's a lot of other stuff we can work on first, I guess.
Yeah, and there's something to be said also about like these giant meals. There's
Yeah,
a limit of what our gut can absorb in a certain amount of time. That's just
right.
physiology. And you mentioned
Yeah,
it with the protein amount.
yeah,
But I've seen numbers before, and I don't know if they're true, but like you in one sitting you cannot absorb more than X gram of protein. Anything more than you
yeah,
take, it's just gonna come out anyway. So
yeah.
spreading it you'll get the benefit of what you're eating.
Yeah, there was actually a study that refuted that real recently, where they showed someone
Interesting.
ate like they did 100 grams of protein at a time, and they showed that they actually did continue to utilize it like over the course of the day. So there's possibly a shift in thinking, but but that was only on protein, right? I think fat and carbs, you would be more likely to store it, right, as fat, because if you didn't need it. Um, but also it's the GI stuff too. Like if you're eating this huge meal, like that doesn't feel good either, right? So I think for stable energy levels and blood sugar is better to kind of space it out.
Sure, but I end up doing it myself all the time, just running around at work and being like, oh, it's already
Forgetting to
5.
eat. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not forgetting. It's literally like, okay, like one meeting, one meeting, one meeting, and then I
Yeah.
look, it's like it's 5 o'clock. It's like, oh
I'm
well.
that person that eats during meetings. I've always been that person. I'm like, I get hangry. I can't do that.
I should draw the line and say no. This is my
Yeah.
food, my
Yeah.
food time. Like, I'll mute
Yeah.
myself and
My
you look at me
dietitian told
eat.
me to.
Yes, exactly. Yep, yep.
Should we go into the coach's corner, Simon?
All right. Well, now let's dive into the coach's corner, and this time we have an expert with us with nutrition. So we gathered questions that are related to nutrition and fueling, and we'll have the expert chime in. And Brian, I'll just listen for this time because my nutrition strategy, especially in races, if you can eat it and not puke it, it's probably a good choice. Um, all right. So first question. The first question, Jen, comes from Mark. So Mark is asking, how often should I eat, drink during a race, and what should I eat or
I
drink?
usually recommend start with eating first, eating every like 30 to 45 minutes in a race. So small amounts more frequently. In terms of so we're going to be looking at, again, primarily carbohydrates. We sort of talked about that, but like for the longer distances, maybe a little bit of protein and fat. The amounts, you'll hear a lot of different things. So we can look at grams of carbs first, and the recommendation with my athletes, I'll do like some calculations based off body weight. The general recommendation is anywhere from 30 to 90 grams of carbs an hour. So that's a really big range, right?
Mhm.
With like bigger athletes needing more for longer distances, needing more for higher intensities, but sort of playing around with what you can tolerate and where within that range. But that could be like at a time, right? It could be a gel that you just down 30 grams at a time, or it could be spaced out more evenly, right? Like it could be, you know, 15 minutes in I ate this and 30 minutes later I ate this, but it's still sort of totaled up over the course of the hour. Or even like for like cold weather sports, I talk to my athletes a lot about like they don't want to be reaching into their pocket for food every 45 minutes. So maybe they're only eating every couple hours, but it's still adding up to the same, right? They're still getting 40 grams of carbs an hour. They just ate it at 80 grams at a time at one point. So a lot of variability with it. Again, you really have to kind of play around with it, but you can also look at calories as a recommendation for um, sub ultras. I usually start with like 150 to 250 calories per hour. For ultras, we usually do a little bit more, like 200 to 300 calories an hour, and then we sort of tweak from there, again based off size of the athlete, what their gut can tolerate, how long they're going out for. So you can look at either way. You can look at grams of carbs, or you can look at calories and know that they would mostly be coming from carbs. In terms of what, to me, sports nutrition products versus real food is mostly a matter of preference. So I
Hmm.
don't necessarily promote one over another. If someone has things that work for them, we'll use them, but if they're having gut issues, we'll try other things, right? I think it's good to try a mixture of things, so you have lots of options. Again, we talked about flavor fatigue before, but also even just like sweet versus savory options, right? So good to practice with a lot of different things. During hydration, again, I would do sweat rate testing to kind of see how much an individual athlete is losing. The general recommendation is 16 to 20 ounces of fluids per hour. So you can use that as a starting off point. And then if you're still feeling like depleted, or you're a heavy sweater, you might be getting a little bit more with that 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium as a starting off point again, and then adjusting based off if you're a salty sweater, if you're feeling nauseous, if you're ending up feeling fatigued, like depleted, then those can be signs that maybe you need more than the averages.
Can I add a follow on to that? I'm curious
Sure.
your take on, especially for a longer event, like let's think like 24-hour, 30-hour. Would you recommend that the same kind of fueling strategy at the beginning of the event and all the way to the end, or you would suggest adjusting a little bit?
It depends. I know a lot of people start with certain products and then they move on to others, but I don't think that it necessarily has to be that way. I think with those big things, what you have to factor in is like those recommendations that I gave you are just for like your moving time, but again, you're missing
Mm.
meals, right? So that you still need more, right? You still need to be accounting for the fact that you ran through lunch and that's, 500 calories you would have had, and like stopping and getting more chunks and then still getting, that 200 or whatever it is calories an hour in addition to those meals,
Mm.
kind of that you're like accounting for when you're doing these super long races. So a lot of people too, like, your gut starts to shut down more towards the end of the race. And so you might think about like they try to do more in the beginning, like eat more. And maybe there's a little more fat, more protein, just like higher volume of food in the beginning to help with that. You can do that. And then for some people that backfires, right? Because then their gut starts feeling gross sooner because they did too much. So you got to kind of be careful with that. Um, I think consistency is probably better.
Brian, anything to add?
Nothing to add. I think that's all great information. I just love it. It's really key. It's part of, and I think that you've already touched on it, but it has to be trained in the training process, and you can't experiment with
Yes,
those things or use those rules in the event. Like you should have already experimented and know what's working really well for
yes,
you. So you should have dialed in if it's going to be
totally.
30 minutes or 50 minutes, and how many
Yep.
carbs or how many grams or how many calories are going to be in that window as well. And that's something that you could do in the
Yep.
training process.
Yeah, you definitely need to be doing it in advance, right? If you show up on race day winging it, it's probably not going to go that well. And don't try anything new, right? Stick to what you know during the race too.
Cool. Well, Mark, thanks for asking the question. And Jen, thanks for answering that. And Brian.
Yeah.
Next question comes from Cassadi. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but that's my French accent. I'm very sorry about
I,
that.
I think it's Cassidy, but
Cassidy, yes. Well, Cassidy, thanks for the question. So the question is, do you have some tips and tricks for learning to eat real food while running? So, beside gels or these
Yeah.
sorts of more sports food.
Yeah, we sort of hit on that in the beginning. So starting with the simpler carbs first, and then working up to more complex carbs, and then add a little bit of protein and fat. So simple carbs, again, excuse me, I always think of fruit, bananas because they're super easy to digest, or like dried fruit. Another go-to of mine is I think Nature's Bakery fig bars. I have no association with the brand, but they just seem to work really well for everyone. They're very high carb, they're yummy. There's lots of different flavors. So starting out with those, or even like pretzels, goldfish, a PB&J, but it's like light on the PB, those types of real food things. A lot of people do like the yogurt covered, not yogurt, well, yogurt covered pretzels will be fine, but the peanut butter filled pretzels, once you're able to start doing a little bit of protein and fat. So there's really like I said, starting with smaller amounts, simple carbs, and then you're working your way up in terms of volume and complexity, and adding a little bit of protein and fat. There's no like right or wrong foods as long as you're thinking like high carbs, and then again just vary like what sounds good to you. Because if you're in a race and you're tired and you don't really want to eat, and you pack something you don't even really like, you're not going to eat it, right? So kind of think about like what things really sound good to you. Like some people will even do like pastries, right? Like if that's what sounds good to you, that's okay if that sits with your gut and you've practiced it. So
yeah, those nature fig bars are like my go-to.
yeah,
If you're
yeah,
listening, Nature Fig Bar, Simon and I would appreciate a
we'd love
sponsorship.
it. Yeah. I'll take
Jen
one
as
as
well.
well. Yeah, yeah. Those are one of my go-tos for after a workout too, because they're so portable, right? Like it can be in your car, it can be in your pack. Good concentrated source of carbs.
In my cupboard right now is like the family pack. I don't know. It's like 40 of them, and there's two of
Yeah, we go
them.
to Costco for
One for
those.
one for each flavor because they only come in single flavors.
You definitely need to get a sponsorship.
Thanks for the insight. And Cassidy, thanks for asking the question.
And Jen, we got one last question, I believe, in the coach's corner. It comes from Thomas, and he wants to know. It's a little bit of a new topic in the ultra world, but he wants to know about creatine and its benefits, and if there are any, and where he can find some resources for that, maybe.
So creatine is one of those ones where I feel like we used to always hear it with strength athletes, right? It's a little bit newer in the endurance realm where I feel like it's a jury still out there, maybe some benefit. So, but my whole thing with any supplement is that it's not going to make up for a diet that is lacking, right? So it's not always start with the basics again of like, are you getting enough on a day-to-day basis? Are you getting the right balance of things? Are you fueling your training adequately and recovering? Because if you're not doing those things, adding creatine is not going to really help you, right? You got to be doing all those basic things. And then we start looking at supplements and can they enhance your performance? So with creatine, again, a little bit, I feel like jury is out. You have to be consistent. You have to take it daily. What it can help with is like muscle power and strength, which you still need in an endurance event, but it's not going to help with endurance necessarily. It may help with recovery. Jury's still out on that again, but that would be beneficial. What it can do is cause GI issues, so we want to be really careful about that because that's already a thing, right, in the ultra running community. Also, creatine, it does cause fluid retention. That's part of it. Like you gain weight when you take creatine. It's fluids, but for people that are kind of worried about racing weight and that kind of thing, that might be a reason to be careful of it. So again, like I would say, have your basics dialed in first and then consider it. And then with any supplement, you have to be really careful about, is it a good supplement? Supplements are not well regulated in the US. And so there's a lot of supplements on the market that either they don't have what they say they have in them or they have other stuff, which is even scarier. So you got to make sure it's one that's third party tested for quality and purity just to know that it's safe, especially if you're like at that level of an athlete where you're getting drug tested. Then I'm very wary of supplements because you really need to make sure that your supplements are pure.
That's great. We appreciate the answer. Sure. Thanks for the question, Thomas, as well. And thanks for the insight, Jen. The last thing is thanks for coming on the show. We really appreciate your time and your energy that you bring to the conversation. Where can everyone find you and what are all your handles and where do you live at?
So I am on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. It's at Active Fueling Nutrition. I am not good at posting on Instagram. Well, this month has been terrible. I've been dealing with a lot of illness in my household, so there's definitely been no posts in March. But I'm on there. I'm trying to get into posting more. If you look back, there's some good posts with some good information for you. But this year has been a little tough getting posts up. But I am on social media on those. I don't tweet. I'm not on the Twitter. In the real world, I'm in Eagle, Colorado, so I'm up in the mountains in Colorado. But like I said, being virtual, I'm able to work with people kind of in a range of areas, which is super awesome. And my website, activefueling.com. There's a lot of good info on there about like my packages and what services I offer and a little bit more info on me. And you can reach out to me on there as well. I do complimentary 15-minute discovery calls for any athlete that's interested in working with me so that we can kind of talk about like, are we a good fit? What are you looking for? You don't have to commit right before kind of chatting.
Great. Again, thank you so much for your time and we appreciate your coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, great discussing with you. Learning a lot for sure.
Take care.